Hope everybody's doing good. Welcome. It's May. It feels like spring outside, doesn't it? That's good. I don't know why my voice cracked right there. That's weird. It's just good to have you guys this morning. All right. Hey, we're going to continue. That's a good start right there. We're going to continue on in a series we started last week, and what we're doing is we're looking at this idea of that lessons from the boat. And so we're looking at different times where Jesus is in a boat, by a boat, something like that, and he teaches something or he examples something to us that's powerful. And so we're going to land, if you got your Bibles or your phones or whatever, go ahead and turn to Mark chapter 4, verse 35. So we're going to read there in just a second, but let me give you an overview, just a reminder of where we're heading this month. So last week we talked about the first one. These are 4 steps that the gospel calls us to. And so 4 steps are this, that we would allow the Word of God to cultivate our hearts so that we can learn to trust Jesus, as we're going to talk about this week, in all situations, and join Him in the supernatural life by living dependent on His grace and not our own works. And so about 17-ish years old, I had an amazing car. It was this color of the sky. It was a sky blue Chevette. You remember Chevettes? Oh boy, it was amazing. It's manual, drag racing and everything. Just kidding, it barely moved. But that was the car. And so we were driving around in it with some of my friends one time. And of course, we were just minding our own business, having a good time. You know the sound system, if you have it, sound system, it was bumping. So tunes were just flying out of that thing. And so we're having a good time. We pull up to this stoplight. And if you think intersection like Alexis Road, so you get the size of where we're at. And my friend Jerry is in the passenger seat. And all of a sudden, no words, no communication. Jerry just throws open the car door and starts to run across the street. And all of us are like, what in the world is going on? So across the street was a Wendy's restaurant, and out front of that Wendy's restaurant was this giant blow-up Wendy's doll, with the pigtails, red pigtails, the Wendy, right? It's a restaurant, I guess. Or is it Dave's? I don't know. Anyway, so Wendy is out front. It's this big blow-up. She's kind of sitting there happy to welcome you in for your Baconator, all this stuff. And Jerry just dives headfirst into the Wendy's blow-up doll and starts stabbing the doll with a pen that he had in his hand. So Wendy goes from happy, excited to see you. She's slumped over. Jerry turns around, runs, gets back in the car, shuts the door and goes, "You should go." It was that fast. We're all like, what in the world is going on, Jerry? And so here's what happened. That moment went from 0 to 60 in no time at all, right? All of a sudden, we're minding our own business, and now we just murdered a Wendy's doll, and we have to run for our lives. And so the crazy thing is we can all relate to those moments that go from 0 to 60, right? You can reference one right now in your life. Maybe it was at work. You show up, everything seems normal, and all of a sudden one decision that somebody makes or one thing that happens, and now there's chaos at work, right? It's everybody's running around, screaming, yelling, trying to figure out what's happening. If you have a family and you live in a home, you've had 0 to 60 minutes or seconds, haven't you? Those moments where all of a sudden, it's all calm, and then one person says one thing, and then it's World War III in your house. And you're like, how did this happen so fast? It was going so good, 0 to 60. Sometimes it's a phone call. And these are serious sometimes too, right? A phone call, one phone call can change everything in your life, right? That one phone call that, hey, this happened, there was an emergency, there was a tragedy. And all of a sudden life goes in a sense from 0 to 60. There's this moment where it's chaos in a sense. And those moments are big deals sometimes for us. Sometimes they're sad, they're hard to take in. Sometimes you laugh about them, whatever. But the reality is in those moments, we have a choice on how we either respond to those moments or how we react to those moments. And I've tried to teach this to my children that there's a difference in reacting and responding. Reacting is usually the initial thought that you have when something happens, and you should probably pause that before you do it, right? Reactions, a lot of times, have apologies tied to them later. Nobody likes to go back and say you're sorry. Reaction is that text message that you fire back because you're ticked off, and you're like, well, I probably shouldn't have sent that, right? Or the email or the voicemail or those things and those where you do something, you're like, boy, I really not just reacted, but I actually overreacted in that moment. Or respond to something where you kind of survey what's happening. You use wisdom and discernment to go, what's the best way for me to handle this? And that doesn't mean that it's a 15-minute process of things. Sometimes that's fast too, but you're at least taking it in and processing what's happening and going, how can I use wisdom to handle this situation? It's the idea of a first responder that shows up on an emergency. They don't just run in and do something. They assess the situation, and then they go, here's the greatest need, and then they respond to the emergency rather than just reacting to the emergency. And so for us, we have a choice on whether we're going to do those two things. And we find the disciples in a very similar situation where they actually react first and then respond second. And we would all completely understand their behavior in this moment. So look at scripture here in verse 35. It says this, that day when evening came, he said to his disciples, let us go over, he being Jesus, let us go over to the other side, leaving the crowd behind. They took him along just as he was in the boat. There was also other boats with him. So it's late, the day's ending. If you read back in the chapter here, what you're going to see is that Jesus was ministering all day, teaching, doing all kinds of things. It's assumed that he was healing people during this process. This is what happened. Like ministry with Jesus was all on deck, hands-on. It was quite a lot of stuff happening all at once, right? So all day they're going for it. Disciples and Jesus. Now it's the end of the day and Jesus is like, hey, I got an idea. We all look really tired and worn out. Let's get in this boat and travel across the lake. And it's easy to dismiss that if we don't understand how big this lake actually was. It was the Sea of Galilee. Now, it is a freshwater lake. It's the largest freshwater lake in Israel. And so when you think about proportion-wise, if you were to row across it, you had 13 miles across in length or 7 miles across in width. At its deepest point, it was 157 feet deep. So this just wasn't like the pond in the backyard. Like this is a big body of water that they were crossing in the middle of the night. And it was also known, which still is today, for these erratic storms that would happen. And the reason is because it's so far below sea level, and then it's surrounded by mountains that are so high above sea level that hot air, cold air comes down, crashes, and it causes these storms that happen out of nowhere. They just, all of a sudden, they're just there. And so this is where we're finding the disciples getting in a boat to cross this Sea of Galilee. And sure enough, in verse 37, if you look, it says, a furious squall came up. And the waves broke over the boat, so it was nearly swamped. Now, how about you? But anytime I've ever been in a squall, it's something to talk about, right? I mean, have you ever even used the word squall? It's actually a lot of fun to say it. Just say it one more time. Say squall. It was enjoyable, wasn't it? It was like fun to say out loud. Yesterday when all the clouds were brewing and stuff, I kept running around the house going, guys, there's a squall on the horizon. My family's like, gosh, man, knock it off. But this squall comes up, and you go, what in the world's a squall? You think like it's just rain, thunder, lightning, but it's not. It's actually a fierce wind. A squall, what the storm that happened here wasn't just like rain and thunder and lightning. It was that this fierce wind comes out of nowhere while they're on this boat or in this boat on the lake. And so when you look at the context of what's said here, a furious squall comes up. This word comes up means out of nowhere. It means it was a surprise when you go back to the original text. That this wasn't something where they saw the clouds moving in, and so they said to the rest of the disciples, they had a conversation, said, hey guys, it looks like there's a storm coming in. You're going to do this, we'll do this, all right, we'll take care of this. It was out of nowhere, 0 to 60. One moment things were fine, the next minute they're in this squall, and it's a furious squall. That word, back to original context, means mega. It means big. It means that they were in a giant windstorm. Hurricane-sized winds is what's reported that's just happening to them. And they're in this boat, and they're trying to get across this lake. And so the interesting thing for me is that if this storm is made up of wind, what we know about wind is this, that wind blows, and you cannot necessarily determine where that wind's coming from, but you can see the effects of it. Right? Trees blow, flags blow, you feel it on your clothes and your face. You can't reach out and grab the wind. You can't collect wind. Like, this isn't something that wind is an elusive idea in a sense because we don't know its source, we don't know where it's coming from, but you feel the effects of it when it hits you. In the same way, the storm that they're in, the correlation between what we face in our life today and what they were facing on this river or this lake years ago is that we are facing a storm today in our lives that is the same. It's hard to nail down. It's hard to understand. It's hard to see where the source is. And so many of us in our lives, we're just like the disciples where we're striving to stay afloat in our lives. And that storm is called anxiety, fear, and panic. The reality of anxiety in our lives and fear and panic in our life has become such a force for us that so many times, if you evaluate this morning, you're like, absolutely, that's me. You feel like you're in this storm that's out of control. Let me give you some statistics, because everybody loves statistics to prove facts, right? So here they are. In the Google searches for the words anxiety, panic, and fear, so the amount of Google searches with those words in it, rose 11% in a 58-day span. So that 58 days was President Trump announced that COVID was a national emergency, and the next 58 days, 11% jump in searches for anxiety, panic, and fear. That 11% in 58 days was a larger jump than we had the previous 16 years of Google searches. Now, because I'm a dork, I Googled 16 years of news. And let me tell you, crazy things happened in the last 16 years. Like, you could just look at the headlines. There was mass shootings, there was bombings, there was tragedies, there was national disasters as far as weather. I mean, all these things happened all over the place for the last 16 years, and yet in 58 days we destroyed the percentage of what was searched for in panic, anxiety, and fear. 11% may not seem like a lot, but what that means is this is just America. That means that in 58 days there were 3.4 million searches with those words in it. Recent survey shows that 31% of adults struggle with an anxiety disorder right now. This is just America. That's 41 million adults, 25% increase since COVID. The National Institute of Mental Health says that approximately 38% of girls and 26% of boys ages 13 to 17 suffer from some form of anxiety disorder. And much like the wind, fear and anxiety are hard to track down the source, but it shoots up suddenly, it comes up as a surprise, and it comes out of nowhere. And all of a sudden, our bodies, our hearts, our minds are overwhelmed with these feelings of anxiety, of fear, of panic. While we don't know where it comes from, the effects are overwhelming and crippling. But this is what we have to know, is that anxiety is 100% real, but it is also 100% a liar. And what it's doing is it's blowing things out of proportion. We are worried and trying to control things that are out of our control. It's a reality that hasn't happened yet, but mentally we're living in it, worst possible scenario, and it's affecting the reality that we're actually in. And this is not the way that God designed us to live. And part of the problem is that we're inundated with so much news. Like, it's a blessing to be able to be connected to the whole world, right? I mean, there's a lot of perks to it, but one of the negative things is we used to find out news about our city, our town, maybe our region, but now in a moment's time, we get news from all over the world. And it's great to be informed on what's happening in the world, but what we have to be careful of is how much social media and news we allow in. Because while we claim that we are informed by this world or to the things of this world, we're actually being conformed to this world and the way that we think and process and look at life. And so this storm's brewing. A squall is happening. And the disciples are freaking out in the boat, and they're trying to do everything they can. The waves are coming in, like they're going to drown in the Sea of Galilee if something doesn't change. And so where is Jesus in all this? Tells us in verse 38. Jesus was in the stern of the boat, sleeping on a cushion. Doesn't that added sleeping on a cushion just tick you off? Like, doesn't it? Aren't you just like, what the heck? Like, he's resting. All right, I can handle that, Jesus. You've been ministering all day, but the fact that he had a cushion for some reason, I'm like, come on, man. Like, the disciples are like rowing, backs aching. Jesus is like, he's just sleeping in the stern on a cushion. You look and you say, what is going on? And so the disciples are looking at this too. Like, a crazy thing is that when you look at this boat, look at the contrast that's happening here. Like, in one part of the boat, you have the disciples that are freaking out because they're going to die, and they're trying to scoop water out of the boat. Who knows if they had buckets? Like, they took their sandals off probably. They're trying to scoop water out with their sandals. And, I mean, can you imagine all that they're trying to do to stay afloat? There's chaos in this portion of the boat, but yet then you get to the other portion of the boat, and there's perfect peace. Jesus is sleeping on a cushion in the middle of the storm. So how does that happen? How can you have chaos and peace in the same boat? Do you know that the peace that's up here with Jesus is offered just as much to the chaos that's in the back with the disciples? So you have this contradiction here of what's happening. And in this moment, you have the disciples that are freaking out. You have Jesus that's sleeping. Have you ever been in one of those moments similar where you're like off your rocker responding to this situation, but the person you're with is like way too chill? You're like, how are you not experiencing this the same as me? Like, this is an emergency here, and they're just like, well, it's not that big of a deal, right? When we were first married, Beth and I just keep telling stories about Beth when I'm preaching. She can't wait for Nate to come back and me to be done talking. So Beth and I, we just got married. We live in an upstairs apartment right down here on Temperance Road. And Pastor Nate and Wendy, they still live down there. So they lived right across the street from us. And so we're in our apartment one day, and there's a storm a brewing. I don't know if it was a squall, but it was pretty close. So something's happening outside. It's gray, there's wind, all this stuff's happening, you know. So we're hunkered down, we're good, we're safe, we've got a roof over our head, everything's good, right? And so, but one thing that we had never experienced before we moved here was back then they would still blow the siren at the fire department anytime there was an emergency, anytime they needed emergency response, that thing would go off and it's like, rah! It was so loud, right? So I never experienced that. I grew up in the city, so every time it went off, I had a level of anxiety that I should be doing something, like that I should be hunkering down or something, right? And so it didn't help that we lived around that. So when it would go off, everybody from the houses around there were volunteer fire departments. So that would go off and everybody would run out of their house towards the fire hall. So then every time I felt like I should run to the fire hall as well because all the other men were, you know? And I just imagine I show up and they're like, who are you? And I'm like, I don't know. Everybody was just running. I just did what you did. You know, I had no idea. So this thing, you know, we're up there, the storm's happening. All of a sudden the fire alarm or the siren goes off at the fire hall. So right away I'm like, well, this storm just got a little serious, right? I'm thinking, who knows what's happening? So it's screaming, rah, all this stuff, and then my phone rings. I answer it, and it's Pastor Nate, who lives across the street from me, my mentor, my pastor, father figure in my life. And he's screaming at me, get over here! And I'm like, what's going on? He's like, there's a tornado. It's coming right down Temperance Road. You got to get over here and get in my basement now. And I'm like, what? And he's like, get over here! Screaming at me. So I slam the phone down, and I go to find Beth. I find her in the kitchen. She decided in the middle of the storm it was a good time to have ice cream. She's pulling the ice cream out of the freezer. I'm like, Beth, we got to go. She's like, can I get some ice cream first? I'm like, no, you can't get ice cream. We're going to die. She's like, well, I want some ice cream. I'm like, there's a tornado coming down Temperance Road. She's like, well, can I just get ice cream before we go? Finally, I'm like, but the ice cream away! Like I'm screaming about ice cream in the house, right? Have you ever been there in a good fight about ice cream? It's amazing, isn't it? I'm screaming about ice cream. Finally, I grab her hand. We leave the house. We're crossing Temperance Road. My head's on a swivel because I'm thinking like Wizard of Oz is happening. And all the siren's blowing. And I look to Pastor Nate's porch. And he's doubled over. And he's laughing at me. And he's holding his hand out like this. And he's like, stop. I was just kidding. Like, why would you kid about something like that? This is what he said. He blamed on me. He said, you hung up too fast. Like he told me I was going to die, and then he said I hung up too fast trying to get to safety. Turned right around, went upstairs. I didn't talk to Pastor Nate for at least another hour. I was so ticked off at him. I was like, jerk, right? But here's the deal, man. I was like here, and Beth was like here. I'm like, we're going to die. She's like, I want Rocky Road. I'm like, I don't even understand where you're at right now, right? But how many times have we been in this situation where like the situation is crazy around us, you're going bananas, and the people you're with are like, This is what the disciples were experiencing. They're going to die in this boat, like it's going to sink, and they're like, hold on, where's Jesus? And he's like sleeping in the boat on a cushion in the middle of a squall. It doesn't make any sense. And so you think about this, like one more thing to add in here is that when we first started reading the scripture, you remember what it said? It said, he said to them, Jesus said to them, hey, I got an idea. Let's get in this boat and head across this lake. You ever think about that? It was Jesus' idea to get them out in the middle of this lake. And if you believe in Jesus like I do, I believe Jesus knew everything. Like he knows what's going to happen. Like he led them into a storm where they thought they were going to die, and then he made a conscious decision in the middle of it to go, I'm going to take a little nap and see how good this gets. So Jesus led them into this storm because sometimes I believe that Jesus lets us walk into a storm so that we can have a revelation of his faithfulness in the middle of that storm. It'd be great if we didn't have to experience all that, but it's not a reality for us. So this is the moment where all of a sudden, have you ever felt like this? Like Jesus is like napping while you're dying. Like this is the contrast we have. And the disciples, this is the moment where for us we go like, God, I don't understand. Like I felt like you led me here and now I'm all alone. God, I feel like you called me to do this and it's going horrible. Like, where are you, God? Like, why did you ask me to do this if it was going to go this bad? Like, you promised me that this is going to be great, and now I'm in the middle of this crazy storm. This was your idea, God, and here I am, and it's going horrible. And in essence, this is where the disciples are at. So they wake him up and they say, don't you even care if we're going to drown? A better translation of this is, have you any care for us at all? Like, is there any care in you for us at all that you'd bring us out in this storm, go to sleep on us? Like, what is going on here, Jesus? They felt abandoned, they felt mad, they felt panic, offended. And we can make some assumptions about this. Like some of those disciples in that boat, not all of them, but some of those disciples, they were actually professional fishermen before they joined Jesus' disciples, which means they understood boats. It also means that this wasn't the first time that they'd ever experienced a squall. Like they'd been in this scenario before. They had an understanding of when the storm comes, what to do in a boat and how to handle themselves. They knew all the workings of the boat. They got that. They were professional fishermen. I wonder, what would it take for professional fishermen to all of a sudden be in the place of panic and fear that they have no idea what to do, and so then they call on the teacher in the boat to help them? I think that we can assume that they had exhausted all their resources, that they were tapped out, right? Everything they knew to do, they did, and it wasn't working. The water was still coming in the boat. The waves were still coming. They were still fearful. There was still chaos around them, even after they did everything that they had known to do, and even probably things that had worked before in similar situations. But they couldn't do it in this one. They were tapped out. Their plans were over. Their backup plans, their contingency plans, anything they had to do was gone. And now suddenly they were done reacting to their situation, and they had the sense to respond to it and go, what would be wisdom? Oh, we should call on Jesus, the teacher, in the boat with us. So they turn to Jesus and they call on his name. And this is our temptation too. It's amazing how long we'll choose to suffer through the storm before we call on the one who can actually speak to the storm. And this is a danger because it gives us a picture of the gospel and what the Bible teaches to us of what the gospel is. And it's a false gospel of self-reliance, of I got this, I can do this, I understand what to do here, I have the strength, I have the wisdom. It's this self-reliance when really the gospel at the heart of it is actually not self-reliance, it's complete dependence on Jesus in these situations. And sometimes our own strength will cause us to rely on ourselves too much. And then we find ourselves tapped out and we're confused at why this happened. So look at what Jesus did in verse 39. It says, he got up, he rebuked the winds and said to the waves, be quiet, or quiet, be still. Then the wind died down and it was completely calm. Total peace now. Jesus speaks and peace happens. And then he looks at his disciples and he said, why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? Why are you so afraid? You know, Jesus wasn't asking them a question to be answered. You know, like Jesus got it, right? He didn't need them to go, well, actually, Matthew's probably like, because he wrote everything down. Matthew's like, actually, Jesus, I actually do have a list here. The first one on it is squall. The second one on it is waves and water. The third is drowning. Oh, the fourth is you sleeping. Like, I mean, they didn't need a list. Jesus wasn't saying like, give me a report on why you're afraid. What Jesus was saying was, think about the reason that you're feeling fear and anxiety and panic in this moment. Jesus understood what a squall was. He knew where their predicament was. It doesn't say that he woke up and it all stopped. It said he woke up, got up, and then spoke to it and it stopped. He experienced what they were experiencing. And so Jesus wasn't looking for an answer out loud of the physical things that they were afraid of. What he was saying is, after all I've done for you, after all you've heard me teach, after all you saw me do, why would you still be afraid in this moment? Where's your faith? In other words, God's faithfulness to us in the moment last year should carry over to the storm this year. And so we can get so caught up that we forget that Jesus is with us. But here's what I want you to understand. Just because God is silent doesn't mean that God is absent. Sometimes we have to walk through that storm a little bit on our own so that it eliminates all of our resources, so we'd finally call to the one that can handle it. This is why in Psalms you see over and over again, David says, remind me. You see, when you read through the Psalms, you see that a ton. Remind me, God, of your faithfulness. Remind me of your everlasting love. Remind me, God, of your goodness, of your provision. And what, in essence, what David is doing is saying, remind me of what you've done so that I can trust what you're going to do. And sometimes it's a blessing, and the Lord calms the storms that we find ourselves in, but sometimes he lets the storm rage, and then he calms the children that he has in it. He brings peace to our hearts in the middle of this storm so that we see that as we walk through this, that we are not alone. So Jesus wakes up. The disciples are freaking out because they're going to drown, right? It's understandable. But the interesting observation is the disciples were focused on the water and the waves. It says that they were afraid of drowning. You don't drown because of wind. You drown because of water and waves. That was their focus. That was the danger to them at the moment. And so their focus was water and waves. But then when Jesus gets up, he actually addresses the wind first. It says that Jesus rebukes the wind. That's a sharp disapproval. That's a strong response. That's Jesus like standing, putting his hands on his hips and using a commanding voice. You'd be like, knock it off, right? I mean, Jesus, he owns that moment. But then it says that he says, quiet, be still to the waves. And so here's the interesting thing is that we don't really have a good translation for those words. And if you go all the way back to, again, original context, what you're going to find is there wasn't a good translation, so they gave us those words so that we would understand as we read what was happening there. But in essence, what Jesus does is he speaks, he rebukes the wind, but then he looks at the waves and the water and he just goes, shh. Jesus shushes the water and the waves. Have you ever been shushed in your life? Two responses, rage or fear, right? Somebody shushes you, you're like, oh, it's on. I know you didn't just shush me, right? I mean, isn't that our response? Unless they have the authority to do it, and then there's fear. You see, there's a reality in the shush game that's this. If the one doing the shushing doesn't have the authority to do the shushing, then the shush is offensive. We all understand this principle in life, right? But if the one doing the shushing has the authority to do the shushing, then the shush brings fear in our hearts. We respond to it. Exhibit A is my grandmother. She would shush like a champion. And it wasn't like a long shh. Like that's pleasant, kinda. Meh. It was like sharp and precision. Shh. Like fast. And if you didn't respond, you were in so much trouble because what came after the shush was the pinch. You see, these were back in the days when we could injure our children into obedience. Do you remember those days? Yeah, praise the Lord for those days. Can't do it anymore. And so she would grab you in your rib cage and just grab the smallest, her fingers were like pinchers. She'd grab the smallest little piece of skin and she'd just lock into it and pinch. And if you responded to the pinch with any noise or any showing that you were being abused in church, then it got worse. It was like even more. And so you just had to go like, you'd have to just take it, right? So this is grandma. Well, the thing is when grandma shushed us, we listened. We straightened up. Why? Because grandma had authority. But if somebody else shushed me, I'm like, nobody can shush me. Who do you think you are, right? Because you question the authority of the person doing the shushing. Well, this means that Jesus had all authority, all power over everything that was happening here. The reason Jesus could just go shh is because he had authority over those things. And so what you see here is that the disciples were focusing so much on water and waves, and they were terrified by this, but Jesus addresses the wind over the water and the waves. You ever think this, that sometimes we can become so preoccupied with the symptoms of fear, panic, and anxiety that we never actually get to the source. But Jesus doesn't want to address the water, he wants to address the wind. Because that's actually what's causing the fear and the panic and the anxiety. One of our greatest things in our lives many times that will bring these feelings up is when we try to focus on the wrong things and we try to control the outcomes. Obsession over details that we actually have no control over will always bring fear, panic, and anxiety. Always. So I got this wheelbarrow here, and it's filled with all these things. And so written on these are like, they're all different things in life that we kind of try to manage in life. And some of them are like worthless, but some of them are real, right? Some of them have value, like there should be some attention to these things, right? And so this wheelbarrow is filled because it represents, in a sense, this is how our life goes, where we collect things that we see and deem as important, that like, I've got to take care of this because it matters. And so we load them up in a sense. You all have a wheelbarrow, whether you realize it or not. You brought it in here this morning. You all have a wheelbarrow, and you load all these things in it, and you go, these are the things that I got to take care of this. This is my responsibility to manage these things. And so you have your job, you have college in here, you have family, you have kids, you have all these different things that are in this wheelbarrow that you've decided you're going to manage in life because this is what's important. The problem is that this wheelbarrow has, one, a max capacity. It can only take so much. And two, you only have limited strength. So once this wheelbarrow gets filled to capacity and it's overwhelming, it becomes more and more difficult then for you to manage this wheelbarrow. But what we do is we pick this sucker up and we take it everywhere we go. And we don't even know it's there. So we're carrying our wheelbarrow, and we got to be careful because if it dumps over, we're responsible for this. What are we going to do? So we're walking through life, we're trying to manage our wheelbarrow, but sure enough, when's are going to happen? Things are going to come along, and all of a sudden, everything's going to fall out of our wheelbarrow, and now what are we doing? You know what our response is to this? We go, well, I'm going to control this more so that those things don't fall out. And then when you try to control this more, what does it do? It brings more fear, more anxiety, and more panic. And then your response is, well, I'm going to control this more so they don't fall out. It's a vicious cycle that we get into because we're worrying about all these things that we actually don't even have control over. You see, it's control issues that rise up in our hearts that cause us to feel fear and anxiety. And some of these things, again, are very important for us to pay attention to, but there's a difference in stewardship and control. God calls us to steward these things, not to control them. And so when we grab a hold of these things and we have this fear that rises up inside of us, it brings us anxiety. So we tighten our grip even more. And it's this idea of perspective. So these things seem like they're so big to us and so massive to us and overwhelming to us, but the reality is it's a perspective issue. You see, so many times we grab these things and then we hold them up, and so like the pictures you're seeing, there's a perspective issue of where they land in our lives. And so if I hold this box up like this, it looks huge. How many of you guys wish the next one? Go ahead to the next one. Oh, don't you wish that was true? Praise the Lord, man. I want to find that beach. So anyways, back to this. So we hold this thing up, right? It becomes huge in our eyes. I can barely see anybody out there. So what we do is we hold all of our issues here and we put Jesus on this side of it. But what we need to do is swap that around. So Jesus is right here, and then we're viewing all of life's issues through Jesus. And all of a sudden it puts all these little boxes in the right perspective. And we see that Jesus has the authority and the ability to help us in all those moments. But sometimes our perspective is so out of balance. And so real quick, the end, in 41, it says that they were terrified. And they asked each other, who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him. I find it interesting in verse 39, Jesus says to them, why are you so afraid? And then everything calms down, and then now we see their response is that they were terrified. You think, for me, I don't know, afraid and terrified are like two different things, right? You think, oh, I was afraid of that, and then somebody else, like, I was terrified. That's like next level response, right? But it's not what these words mean, actually. The first one means what we would think. Afraid means timid, fearful, overwhelmed by the moment. This is where the disciples were when they were in the middle of the storm. And so this is what Jesus says, like, why did you feel so afraid in this? Remember the level of not understanding that Jesus was there and able to take care of. Why do you feel so afraid? Well, now in 41, it says that they were terrified. This word terrified means that they were struck with amazement, that they were in reverence and awe. Depending on the version you read, you're going to read that word awe. Or that some say that they were terrified and amazed. And it's this idea where all of a sudden it goes fearful of the things that are happening to amazed at who they're with. They went from complete fear of what was outside of the boat to complete reverence for who was inside the boat with them. They saw this in different light. All of a sudden, Jesus was more than teacher, how could you let us drown, to a revelation that actually this was divinity in their boat. That this wasn't just a mere man that said some really cool things, that this was God. That only He could have authority to speak to the wind and the waves in this moment. And that question of who is this man wasn't because they were confused at who was standing in the boat. It's because they had complete clarification as to who was in the boat. It's equivalent if you get an iPhone for Christmas, you open that box up and you go, oh my gosh, what is this? You know it's an iPhone, right? It's not a question of what's in the box. It's a question of amazement that you actually have what's in the box. It's the same thing that the disciples are saying, who is this that could command the winds and the waves and have the authority for this to happen? They went from reacting and being fearful in the moment when they thought they were dying to responding to Jesus, and now amazement shows up. And this is what I love about this whole story, is that if you think about it, they went from chaos to calm in a word, right? Jesus just spoke and it was over. Complete calm, the scripture tells us. But really, if you think about it, they were still surrounded by all the elements that created the chaos. It doesn't say that like Jesus calmed the storm and then suddenly they were all standing on the shore and they were just like, high fives, that was crazy. It doesn't say that. They had to literally sit back down and then row themselves the rest of the way across the lake. They were still in the middle of the lake. So all the water, all the elements, everything was there. They were still in a boat. There was probably still water in the boat from what just happened. Like they're still in the middle of the situation that brought chaos in their life. They're still in the place where worry could rise up. The unknown was there. And yet somehow they found from chaos to perfect peace. It's because Jesus. See, here's the unfortunate reality for us. Is that fear and panic and anxiety and whatever other word you want to use for that, it's waiting for you as soon as you leave that door. When you get up and you walk out of this building, it's there. When you wake up tomorrow morning, it's going to be knocking on your door. It's going to be whispering to you, say, hey, I'm right here. We should really be fearful right now. Are you sure all this is going to work out? All those fears, all those anxieties, they're all waiting for you as soon as you leave this place. They may be talking to you right now in the middle of it. And so the thing that we have to grab here is that having perfect peace from Jesus doesn't necessarily mean that our surroundings change. They're still in the middle of all this, but their understanding of who's in the boat with them changes their reaction. So for them, they no longer are fearful of the things that are outside the boat because they realize who's in the boat with them. Trusting in the power of God in the storms of life causes the peace of God to rule our hearts. So the questions I want to ask you is this, is what would your life look like? Like what would happen if you recognize that Jesus is in the boat with you? What would happen if you recognize that Jesus is not just a teacher, but He's also creator? What would happen if you stopped carrying the weight of this world and all the things on your shoulders, the responsibilities, and you allowed Jesus to come in and bear that burden with you? How much of our thinking would be freed up? How much of the weight that we carry would be lifted? How much joy would we suddenly experience in our lives? Because I believe this, that Christ came to set the captives free, and that doesn't just mean that He came to set those free that are addicted to drugs, alcohol, and all kinds of sin. That He also came to set us free in our heart, our mind, and our soul. That there's a freedom that Christ wants to bring in our lives where we don't carry the weight and the burdens of all this world on us, that we recognize the one who is in the boat with us. You got to realize that you were designed with a purpose. You were designed to withstand these storms that are going to rise up and that are going to come at you, and the whispering of panic and fear. You were designed to withstand all of those things, but you were not designed to withstand them in your own strength. And so we have to rely on the one that has the authority in those moments to carry us through. When we've done everything that we know to do, we've exhausted our resources, we need to finally get to the place where we go, hey, Jesus, you want to jump in and help me out here? And the crazy, powerful thing is that Jesus is always willing and ready. In a moment's time, he's willing to step up in the craziest situation and just say, peace, be still. And he hushes the storm and the fear in our lives. The revelation of who's in your boat will allow you to see what's out of your boat in the right context. So the question then for you is, will you trust him? Will you depend on his authority? Will you depend on that he has all power over these things? That he created this earth, so he has dominion over this earth. And what I know about my life, it's probably as well as yours, is that when it comes to anxiety and fear and dealing with these things, that I need presence more than I just need practices. That I need to be with Jesus in order for him to calm my heart. Because it's crazy how caught up we can get in the boat dealing with the storms and all these things that we just forget that Jesus is there. And so what I want to do is remind us that Jesus is in that boat with you. That you're not bailing that boat out on your own, that it's not on your own strength, that he is there with you and he wants to carry you through this. He wants to speak to the chaos and bring peace in your life. And so what I want to do is this morning when you came in on your seat, there was these little cards that says, Jesus, I trust you with. And you may need longer than this, but this morning we're going to take 30 seconds. And what I want you to do is grab that card, get a pen. There's someone in a seat somewhere around there. You might have to share a pen with somebody. But 30 seconds, this is what I'd like you to do. On that card, as best you can, write down those things. You go, these are the things that I am fearful about right now. These are the things that are causing panic in my life. These are the things that are causing fear in my life. You may need to flip that card over and write on the back as well. You may need to take your neighbor's card because you got so much to write down. That's all right. But just write down those things that bring you panic and fear, that you just go, Jesus, I need you to show up in this situation. And then we're going to respond in a moment. And so 30 seconds, just write a few of those things down that are on your heart. Will you go ahead and stand up with me? Here's how I'd love for us to respond this morning. Some of you guys are still writing. Just go ahead and keep writing. Here's how I'd love for us to respond. Allie's going to sing a song called Bigger Than I Thought You Were. This song just speaks to that revelation that God is bigger than we could ever imagine. But there's a part in the song that says, I lay it all in your hand. I forgot the lyrics now. It's great. It's about... Leave your rest of your hand, thank you. Whew. It's 11 o'clock, I'm struggling. Leave it in your hands, God. You get the concept. But as we respond to the heart of this song is just to say this, that God, you're bigger than I could ever imagine. And in the midst of my unbelief, would you help me believe that you're able to take care of this situation? And so what I want to ask, if you feel comfortable, that as we sing this song, we always say the front of the church is open for prayer and for whatever, but we've got these two wheelbarrows up here, and these wheelbarrows are just as symbolic. They just represent, this isn't your wheelbarrow that you're going to lug out of here. This is God's wheelbarrow that you're leaving this stuff in his hands, and then you're walking away from it and allowing him to have the control of these things in your life. And so if you want to, as we sing this song in response, just to come up and bring your card and just throw it in that wheelbarrow. It's just symbolic, saying, God, I'm done carrying this on my own. I need you. Teacher, I'm drowning. And then let him show up as God. And so just to take a few minutes to do that, and then as we sing, if you want to stay up here and spend some time in prayer, and then I'll come back and close us in prayer. And let's respond to the Lord. Let's see what happens. Let's test the Lord and say, I'm going to give you this, God, and see if he doesn't bring you peace today in your hearts.